Yeah. Why don't you give me that?
Okay.
Actually, you know what?
915.
I have it. I have it here.
Okay. And then I just went on YouTube, Ed, and it's telling me that it's waiting for WRSD online. Oh, there it is.
Yeah. Why don't you give me that?
Okay. 915.
I got it. I got it here, Randy.
So I'm sorry, I was doing two things. Do you need the phone number?
No, I got it.
Okay, good.
I suppose the other option is I can call her and put her on speakerphone, and we can see if that works.
Hi.
Oh. Hi, Carolyn. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I can't seem to get on. It says Management Subcommittee, 6 o'clock. I click it and nothing. It just keeps saying it won't go through.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, you're here telephonically, so we will we'll take it. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll call to order the meeting of the Management Subcommittee. I believe we have a quorum. Tonight, seeing as we're starting at 6 o'clock, I know that we have a couple of meetings scheduled for 7. So we're going to try to time box tonight and wrap up just before 7 o'clock, so others can go to the next thing. And if there is more for us to discuss, and there probably will be, then we'll schedule a part 2 for this conversation. So with that, the next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. We do not have the minutes for this evening, so we're going to pass that over. So we'll go into the superintendent search process, next steps. And Carolyn, I'll look to you to kind of talk us through, at this point, the screening committee has worked very diligently. They are putting forward a slate of candidate finalists. So do you want to talk to us about what happens next?
All right. What happens next is the ball now goes into the school committee court, and the school committee is responsible for all of the next steps, and they must be conducted in public. So with that said, you will have each candidate will provide you with a reference grid with at least 12 names on it, hopefully more. And it's like Noah's Ark, 2 teachers, 2 administrators, 2 school committee members, 2 of this. And you'll get that reference grid. You'll have to make some decisions about how you're going to call references. And I can give you some recommendations if you'd like them now from NESDEC's perspective. Would you like me to go over some recommendations?
No, let's circle back to it. I mean, I think that you're going to probably list out a bunch of things, and then we'll need to circle back on some of them. So if you could walk us through maybe the process, and then we can circle back.
All right. The process is that on Monday, the 28th, the chair of the screening committee will announce the finalists to the school committee. At that time, the school committee members will be given a link from NESDEC to the application materials for the finalists. And those application materials are confidential. They will include transcripts from the candidates, as well as their letters of references and all the material that they submitted to apply for the position. The screening committee saw all of that material, but not the transcripts. They were not included in the screening committee packet. The candidates cannot be discussed between school committee members. So this is a confidential process. The names will be, each school committee member will get the names of the candidates. Then on March 3rd, there will be a workshop for the school committee. and I will join, and we will talk about, the interview process. We will talk about inviting the candidates for a day in the district, and I can go over what that looks like. And we will talk about how how the school committee is going to check references, and then how it will schedule its deliberations and maybe some procedures for deliberation. So those are the next steps in the process.
Great. So, Carolyn, you mentioned that the next round of interviews, which is really the last round of interviews, will be done in public. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that typically looks like?
What that typically looks like is and I will give the school committee members a list, some sample questions, interview questions. But generally what it looks like is the chair, welcomes the candidate and asks an opening question. And then each member of the school committee who wishes to, some may not wish to, each member who wishes to may ask the candidate a question. And depending on the number of questions, if all 21 people want to ask a question in a 90-minute interview, then that allows about 4 minutes per answer. So you can decide as a school committee, if you ask 15 questions, then you have 6 minutes per answer. If you ask 21, you have about 4 minutes per answer, and you can make those decisions. But every member goes around and asks a question in a conversational style. It should be relaxed and professional. And that's the interview. The candidate will have spent a day in Wachusett before the interview. Will have spent the entire day in your district, and then we'll come to an evening interview. So one of the things, of course, that you can ask the candidate is, now that you've had an opportunity to visit our district, how has your perception changed, or what new knowledge have you gained, that type of thing. Any particular questions you have about the interview process? Because I will go over that at the workshop.
Right. So let me open it up to others. I did hear you say that interviews in school committee are typically 90 minutes.
Right.
Giving folks an opportunity to ask a question, probably one question and no follow-up if everyone wants to ask a question. Let me open it up to folks. Does anyone have any questions about the interview process for Carolyn? Ken?
So prefacing this by the fact that I don't like this, I know in the past other committees have had, okay, we're going to ask everyone the same question. So what's the balance between consistency from interviewee to interviewee versus asking questions that are relevant to that person's background, which may or may not be different than the other folks?
Right, and that's a difficult question. We would like the tenor of the interview to be relaxed and conversational, and naturally you want to chase the conversation where it goes. But this is a public process, and the public will be watching for possible what they perceive to be inequities. And there are a number of people in the public that maybe they're misinformed, but they do believe that everybody needs to be asked the same question, but at the same time, in the same way, in order for something to be perceived as fair. So we say, make sure that you have, for instance, if you're asking the budget question, that you ask basically the same type of question, the same theme of question, the same of each candidate, so that people can't say, well, they asked 3 budget questions of this candidate and only 1 of the other. And, so our recommendation is, if you have a very public process and you have 21 members, you might want to have each member pick a theme and ask basically the same type of question of each candidate. Is that what you want? I don't think that you should have to have an index card with it printed out, but maybe, Michael, you can talk about how it worked in the screening committee. you sometimes adjust your question a little bit if somebody is a sitting superintendent and if somebody is not coming from that position, but basically you should be asking the same questions.
Sure. So, in terms of how it was done in the screening committee, and I think it actually worked quite well. We asked folks to put forward questions that they were interested in, and that became kind of the menu or a starting menu for questions. And from there, Laura worked with Carolyn to add some polish in some cases, some of the questions, and then selected kind of a list of probably 15 or 16 questions overall. And what we had asked of her to do to make the interview conversational was to pick the order of the questions based on the responses. And so, for example, if there was a question about budget, and the answer involved school committee, then they might pivot to some school committee related types of questions, for example. So everyone had the same menu. She would call upon people to ask their questions at a time that she thought was appropriate and conversational. And the one other thing that they did that I thought was interesting was she asked folks to either volunteer or put forward singular one candidate-specific question, so that question could be asked of any particular candidate. And again, so those questions were collected in advance. We kind of ran them by Carolyn. And then Laura made them available for everyone, so that all of the interviewers were operating off the same play sheet.
So that's, I think that's a nice way to organize it. If you could possibly have, maybe just 18 interview questions, then you could save time at the end for the candidate to talk about anything they feel is important that you haven't asked them. And you could have time for a candidate-specific question, unless one of the 21 members says, I'm not going to write a particular question. I volunteer to ask the candidate-specific question. So there are different ways to arrange it, but I agree with whoever it was that asked the question. Sometimes there's an elephant in the room or something that you want to address, and you say, I didn't get a chance to because I had my scripted question. And you want to leave a little bit of flexibility if you can, so that it does look like you're actually, talking with a specific person rather than, whoever sits in that chair gets the same treatment. Any questions about that?
Or thoughts or feedback, in terms of does the model that was used in the screening committee sound like one that we think could be workable, beneficial for the full school committee? Sherry?
I understand the reasoning behind it, but I think that with all of us, I don't know how to phrase it. I guess I think that we're going to have a lot of the same questions to start with. And I don't know, if I want to ask the same question that Linda wants to ask, who's going to ask that question, and then somebody's going to come up with a new question. I don't know. What we'll do in the work. Go ahead. What we'll do in the workshop is I will ask everybody if they would tell us the theme that they would like to write a question. What is it that you'd like to ask a question around, and we'll get a sense of what everybody is going to ask. And most of the time, school committee members prepare 2 questions apiece. And each one then, as they're listening, will ask, if their first question has already been asked, they'll ask their second. But it seems with such a large school committee, you don't want to make the process, you don't want to confuse the process. So we'll have to think about
if everybody states their theme, then I think maybe if you hear somebody else has already taken your theme, you can agree to ask a follow-up question to theirs, or else maybe choose a different area.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah, I
like
mean,
to
I
see
think the
more.
way that Laura handled it was that she, they asked for questions in advance, and then they worked through, they eliminated duplicates, and as Carolyn mentioned, some people put forward 2 or 3 questions. Now, at the end of the day, we won't have time for anyone to ask more than one. But by collecting all the questions in advance, it allows you to pre-screen out duplicates.
Right. The screening committee, the school committee doesn't operate under the exact same rules, because you won't have the time that they had to keep talking about their questions and working it out. So you'll find it that you're a little more restricted in the conversations. But it has worked fairly well when each school committee member goes and writes their questions and asks it. It hasn't really been a problem.
Sherry again?
Is there a typical number of questions? I mean, obviously we have a very large committee, so if a committee normally had 5 people, would they each be asking 4 questions, and 20 is a good number, or is 20 a crazy number?
20 is kind of a crazy number, but
So
usually
are we better off to really truly just look at 10 or 15 questions or whatever with follow-up time?
Well, I'm not sure of the politics of your group, whether somebody would say, I didn't get a chance to even ask a question. So you have to be open to the fact that if 21 people want to ask a question, I don't know how you'd say to somebody you can't. Unless when you're listening to your themes, somebody says, oh, all right, that's what I wanted to ask. So I'm good at not writing my own question because so-and-so will take that theme. But if you just do a simple time grid, if you ask 14 questions, then that allows like 6 minutes, which is a long time per question, but that allows it to be more conversational because you ask the question, the candidate answers, the asker can look to the chair and say, I have a follow-up, or I'd like to just push that a little further. There's time for that. When you add more questions, you get less time for somebody to say, oh, just could you explain that a little further? Or you mentioned this, could I just hear that about that, please? So that you just have less time for that relaxed. But we say in 90 minutes, you should probably have maybe at the most 18 questions at the most.
So I feel like in our workshop, if we discuss these themes and base our questions not necessarily by person, but by an agreement that these are the things that we want to cover, that it would be more effective in finding something out about someone than shooting off 21 random, well, I know it wouldn't be random, but 21 things just to get more questions in.
I agree. What we usually recommend, and what we recommend to the screening committee, and they really did a beautiful job of this, was taking the candidate profile, and there are the 4 main categories. And it pretty much covers everything: budget, curriculum, everything. And you choose you think up your question, or you develop your question, and we provide lots of good examples and sample school committee questions. And you say, all right, mine would go under that first category, or mine would go under the second. And then you look to see as a committee how many questions you might have, 7 or 8 or 9 under the first category, and 2 under the second, and 7 or 8 or 9 under the third. And you say, maybe we need to either ask people to shift, or we don't need to ask this many questions around the same theme.
Thank you. So Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, just briefly. How do we deal with, I'll either say a rogue questioner or a rogue answerer? So the questioner I'm going to say is, you can imagine somebody being like, oh, I went off in the internet and I saw this article about you from 1994 about this. What would you like to say? Off the top of their head. Or answer rambles on for 10 or 15 minutes after the first two questions and realize we're only going to get through 3 or 4 questions. I may judge them based on that, but you know, yeah.
Well, one of the responsibilities that I have, and one of the burdens on the chair, is to say to the candidates, you're going to be meeting 21 people, and each would like to ask a question. So if you go over, it's going to result in some members of the school committee not being able to ask a question, or so watch your time. And Mike, as chair, will say it probably more delicately than that. He'll say, you know, we have 21 questions. We'll signal you if we can, if we have limited time, if we're losing time, and then there's only so much you can do, because it's telling if a candidate keeps going over and keeps going over. That's telling too.
To address the first part of your question, Ken, you know, I think that was part of what, you know, getting or requesting the questions in advance, and then adding polish. So, you know, you're able to kind of perhaps take a question like that and put it in a more delicate way by doing some pre-processing that the screening committee did.
Right. And I'm going to talk to the school committee about gotcha questions. What's the appropriate form if you really feel you need to have a gotcha? I don't think at a public meeting that's being, if you decide televised or whatever, it should show you at your, it should show you in your best light, because the candidate is also sitting there thinking, will I enjoy working with this school committee? Will I enjoy, is this a school committee I feel that I could really get some things done and we could work together as a team? And if they come away feeling that somehow they were, you know, somebody was trying to get them, or that they were publicly embarrassed, then they may say to me, you know, I appreciate the opportunity, but it's not a place that I think is a match.
Right, got the point. Linda Woodland, you have a question?
So if we can just go back to the question development process. So if we're submitting the questions, that would be done at the workshop or ahead of the workshop. And then how is the polishing done? And does the school committee get a kind of yay or nay vote on whatever polish is done to the questions before the interviews begin?
Do you want to take that, Michael? Because our typical way of doing it as NASDAQ is to say, you pick your theme, here's some sample questions, come to the interview ready to ask them. But like Michael said, that doesn't lead to a real conversational flow. It sometimes it leads to jumping from topic to topic. So maybe, you know, maybe.
Yeah. So you know, what I was doing was sharing with you what the screening committee did as a framework. So, you know, we can take it, leave it, or modify it. Right. What I'll offer is this: what the screening committee did was we had a workshop where we talked about the themes. The committee was given homework to develop their questions and to send them in to Sue Sullivan, who collected them by a certain point in time. And, you know, from there, you know, Laura worked with Carolyn on, you know, the questions and developing kind of the final cut of the questions that she came into the interview sessions with. So, you know, there was not a lot of time to debate, vote, or go through that kind of process with those questions. So, and I'm not sure that we would have a lot of time to do that either if we were to take this kind of method.
Right. Right. You know, probably the way to do it is to, again, submit your question under one of those 4 themes. So as the chair is saying, all right, you know, I'm just going to pick a name, Roberta, if you'd like to ask your question, he knows that he's staying within that theme. And then he would ask the five people who were under the next theme to start asking theirs, and it would probably promote a flow that way.
Linda?
So then would it make sense for the committee to be, as a whole, be given some homework going into the workshop so that the questions can be discussed together for that polish, or is that like just totally blowing up the process? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm fine with whatever. I'm not sure what your procedures are. I don't want to step on your toes. You know what your school committee procedures are. It could be that on Monday night, I know you have other business, but on Monday night, when the names are announced, we could provide you with the workshop packet and a suggestion that you read the section on questions and come to the meeting on the 3rd ready to talk about a question you're interested in asking. It's up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what the goal of the workshop is, right? And so if the goal of the workshop is to kind of talk about the kinds of things that we did in the workshop, right? Which is, you know, what makes for a good question? What are some examples of questions that you would want to avoid? What's the purpose? How do they align to different themes?
Right.
You know, that was something that was done for the screening committee in a workshop. And then upon hearing that, people were sent off to develop their questions, having been informed by that workshop.
Right.
It would seem to me that if we did it the other way around, have them come up with their questions and then give them a workshop, then we would probably be spending a lot of time talking about what were good questions and what weren't. And I'm not sure
Right.
that's probably the most productive way to do it.
Okay. Okay. So probably what's going to happen, I think what's going to happen is on March 3rd, we'll go all over what makes a good question, what makes a theme. People will pick their themes and either submit them submit them however that is done, because you can't deliberate, to maybe Susan or whomever, and have them sort of organized by theme and asked by theme. I don't think you're going to have time to do a lot of polishing, but we haven't found that at the school committee level that a lot of polishing is necessary.
No, and maybe that's the answer here, right? I mean, you know, part of what we did in the screening committee is that we relied and kind of leaned on Laura as the chair to take us from kind of the raw questions to having the script and the playbook. And that required some level of trust and faith in Laura to do that. And so, you know, in this case, if we feel like, you know what, we get it, we're going to kind of try to be in alignment on making sure that we have themes covered so that we're not crazy heavy on one, but super light on another. And beyond that, everyone brings their own questions to the table, and we'll see what we got on first interview day. That's the other way to go.
That's the typical way.
Yep.
That is the typical way.
That's the typical way with a much smaller school committee too.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a little different than our situation.
Yeah, it is definitely. But you know what? It could work. You have 90 minutes, and there might be somebody that says, you know, my question's been answered, so I think I'm good.
Yeah. So does anyone have, you know, thoughts one way or the other? I mean, we kind of put out two frameworks. Anyone have a strong feeling one way or another? I mean, my thinking is the default is to go with the latter, is just to try to have alignment on themes and people show up with their questions. Are we good with that? Okay, I'm not hearing any objections. So anything else regarding interviews before the interview process before we move on?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
Just what I'll go over in the workshop, questions not to ask, and
Right.
things that you want to appear in your best light, and things not to do, etc.
All right. Ken, you have a question?
Does that include the day in the life discussion, or are we going to come to that?
We're going to come to that. So, but before we do, Carolyn, you shared with me before that you have some perspective on recording versus streaming. You
Right.
want to talk about that?
Sure. A lot of school committees stream their meetings, but when it comes to interviewing candidates for the position of superintendent, that doesn't work as well as you want it to, because it puts the school committee at a disadvantage when it comes to candidates number 2, 3, and 4, because you're not sure, or candidates 2, 3, and up to whatever, you're not sure that you're hearing their true, unvarnished answers, or have they watched the previous candidate's interview and heard the questions and rethought, and it also makes it a little bit unfair to the candidates, because each one can watch the previous candidate's interview. So what the more typical procedure is that the local television station or network or whatever you use tapes the interviews. And when the interviews are completed, then the local television station plays them, probably on a loop, but for a day or 2 days or whatever the committee decides. There will be, for the day in the district and for the evening interview, if the committee decides, there will be electronic response forms or feedback forms that the community can give you their impressions. So they would go to the website and they would click on the name of the candidate, Carolyn Burke, and they would say, and there'll be some questions that they can respond to, their impressions of the type of superintendent I would make. And those will become available for school committee review. And for that, you want to have the most access to the interview. So you play them. You might say, okay, we're going to play them all day Monday, and then deliberate on Tuesday, or whatever your schedule is.
So, so there was a lot to unpack there, or quite a few things to unpack there. So let me mention a couple things that I heard. Right. So one is because of the nature of these meetings, Carolyn, what I'm hearing you say is that we should strongly consider not streaming these meetings live, but rather recording them. And in our district, we make the recordings available on demand. So not only are they replayed on Holden Cable, but they're also available on demand. But part of what I'm hearing you say is that we hold the recordings until all the candidate interviews have been done, and then we make them available on demand or otherwise for some period of time. And so what that means is, if we have, I think when we try to put some markers out on the calendar, what that means is if we have, 4 candidate finalists, rather than doing the 4th interview on the 14th and deliberating on the 15th, we probably need to push that back to like the 17th. If on the other hand, we wind up with 3, and deliberations could be on Monday, that might work fine. And then the other thing that I heard you say too is that in some cases, or in some searches, you give people who have met the candidate in the day in the district an opportunity to provide feedback. But I think I'm hearing you go beyond that, which is to say anyone who has watched the thing on demand and has an opinion can also give feedback. Am I hearing you right?
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
So having said all that, let me open it for thoughts and questions. Okay.
How do we process all that information that comes in?
I know. I know. It is a lot. You know, you'll see people, committee members sitting, you know, looking over, and you have to be careful because you can't deliberate without being at a meeting, but you'll see people sitting at the meeting and reading notes and looking over notes, and those notes can be made available to you to go and read. You know, we can look at that, but it's a lot. You have a huge job ahead of you, a huge job. They won't come in all at once. So when they have the day in the district and the interview, the people who met them in the day in the district will probably go and do their responses. So they won't come in one fell swoop. They'll come in a time frame, and maybe you can take smaller bites of the apple. But it's a lot.
I would think that we can control that a little bit, right? I mean, you know, we can time box, you know, by when, if there are people who are interested in providing feedback, by when they could provide that feedback. And then as a practical matter, I would assume that we, you know, make this available through a Google Drive available to the school committee members, you know, and we have to kind of work backwards into, you know, how much time is enough time to, you know, shut down the feedback faucet,
Right.
and be able to process what we have.
Right. It is a lot to process, but people like to give their feedback.
Thoughts, questions? Linda?
So the feedback, would that be pre-made questions or just all your thoughts for the community? It's just all your thoughts, open comment section?
Right. No, we will provide, and I'll bring it to the workshop and show you. We'll provide you with what will be asked on that, you know, for your approval. What school committees have put up online, we'll give you those questions and say, these are what we're going to put up with for each candidate. And unless somebody has a really different suggestion, we'll probably go with that. And it's not just an open-ended question. It's specific to, do you feel that this candidate would make a good superintendent in district, that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. That should be a lot easier to, I mean, it's still going to be a lot, but
and you know what?
Go through than an open, yeah.
Right, but it's going to be, these candidates have some real strengths. You have people who have risen to the top and they are successful in their field. And so naturally you're going to have a very difficult decision, because somebody's going to say, well, I just think Carolyn should be our superintendent. And the next person's going to say, what? Not Laura? It absolutely has to be Laura. And somebody's going to want Peter, you know, that kind of thing. And equally so, somebody's going to say, oh, I'm moving out if Carolyn is the superintendent, and somebody else is moving out if Peter's the superintendent. So you're going to find you're still going to be left with making decisions, but they're good. You know, these are not going to be easy decisions because you have good candidates.
Yeah, so we've got about 15 minutes left on the clock. Let me ask, does anybody have any major heartburn about the notion of not streaming these interviews and releasing them after the last candidate was interviewed? I'm not seeing any objection there. And then obviously, you know, we'd probably be looking at having a 2 or 3 day, probably a 3-day window between the last candidate interview and deliberations, whether it's, you know, ultimately winds up being 3 or 4. Any concerns about the feedback process? Obviously, we'll get a little more detail about what Carolyn's envisioning as the mechanism, but assuming that we can put some curbs and deadlines around this, any thoughts or concerns there? Okay.
just to what Linda said about maybe, I like the idea of it being quantifiable and less opinion. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, is this going to be a good candidate? Scale of 1 to 10, is this a good fit for our district? Whatever the questions are, so that we can just have a visual more than lengthy
All right.
answers would be helpful.
Okay, so more of a Likert scale. I'll see if that's possible. Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, quantifiable, it can be a Likert scale. It could be the absence or presence of a quality, right? I mean, there's different ways of, I mean, you know, I think the question that you mentioned as the example before is an open-ended question. And so that gives people catharsis to be able to write whatever they're thinking and why. And so, you know, the question is, do we want to do that? Or would we rather have something that's more like a checklist or something that's more like a Likert scale?
Well, you could do both. You could have, maybe you could have a couple of things, and then if they want to add a comment.
Okay.
We can think that. We can think
Carolyn
about
will
that.
think on that one. Okay, great.
Do that thought.
Thank
Okay.
you for that. So, so maybe
Dan?
if we can cover the district day.
Okay.
And Carolyn, if you can just maybe talk to us about, maybe let's start with, I mean, what are the typical objectives of a district day?
Okay.
And what does that generally look like?
All right. There's both, the school committee has an objective and the candidate has an objective. So the school committee's objective is to find out as much as they can about the candidate by watching him or her interact in a number of settings. And the candidate wants to find out about the district to see if it's a match for, you know, for his or her skills. And everybody in the community wants to interact with the candidate because they feel that they should be able to meet the candidate and provide feedback. So there's multiple goals there. So you start off by saying, as a school committee, what do we want the candidate to see in our district? What do we really want them to see? And it's usually the central office, the business office, et cetera, and the high school and a middle school and an elementary school. You want them to meet the leadership team, and you want them to meet the, you know, as many staff as they can and parents. And the school committee members, of course, escorting them around, and we can talk about that. So you think about whom you'd like them to meet and what you'd like them to see, and then you try to arrange a day. And I provided like a grid. You arrange the day to see if you can schedule that, and it's a challenge. And so it would be, maybe they start off in the central office, and then they meet some administrators, and they go to an elementary school, and maybe they meet parents there, that type of thing. I don't know how specific you want me to be, but when you're scheduling, you want to schedule in times that parents know they can show up and meet the candidate, times when staff know they can go to maybe the high school library or whatever it is and meet the candidate. And the same with you want to go down the list and say, have I given an opportunity for teachers and staff to go and meet and greet? Have I given that same opportunity to parents? Is the candidate going to be interacting with students, and where would that be? Are they going to be in the classrooms? All of those things. So it's a rather full day for the candidate. And then who's going to be escorting the candidate around the district? And that's generally volunteer school committee members, and you have to schedule that and arrange who's doing what.
Right.
I'm trying to give you a very fast path at this.
Yeah, and so what I'm doing, Carolyn, you can't see it. I just started projecting my screen, and so taking, you know, one of the NASDAQ sample schedules and kind of laying it out on a spreadsheet. What I'm projecting is just a straw man. It's a sample, and you know, so it starts off with, you know, starting in central office, and basically the patterning for the most part is that there's some sort of tour and there's an opportunity to do a meet and greet. And so, you know, starting with central office, going to an elementary school, a middle school, then in the high school, trying to open it up to a little more different groups, right? So lunch with students, for example, a tour, meet and greet with parents, meet and greet with staff. And you know, a lot of this is logistics, and will need to be coordinated. And I'm going to look to Susan to help us with a lot of that. So exactly how this falls is subject to logistics and what makes sense. But what I wanted to get some sense of from this group is, does this feel right in terms of balancing access to the candidate, being able to show them the things that we think that they would want to see in the district, and also not killing them, trying to build in a little bit of breathers. Ken?
Three real quick things. One, you're not killing them. Like even just faculty at higher ed jobs, it's like 3 days sometimes. So 1 day is fine. Two, I think you want to be careful that all the schools aren't in Holden, even if it's convenient, that they see different parts of the district. And third, I think you have to think real hard through that dinner with school committee members thing to make sure that, like, you know, if I have dinner with candidate A and not B and C, is that prejudicing me towards A because they were nice and don't really know B and C as well? Are we going to deliberate at that dinner? I think it have to be thought through carefully about what that looks like. I don't have an answer, just something to think about.
Okay, Linda?
So I was wondering about including the ECC. I know it's a long day as it's laid out here, but the ECC is part of the job. So I don't know if that can be brought into the section with central office. And I would second too with what Ken said about making sure it's not all convenient, getting the good breadth of the district.
Yeah, no, I makes sense. My thinking is that you know, you don't want to put the burden either on just a couple of schools doing rinse and repeat, right? So we're going to share this around. Sherry?
And so school committee members are taking them through these places. Is that correct?
Usually,
To be determined. Go ahead, Carolyn.
usually they do. They just walk and observe. You know, they try not to interfere with people being at the site, being able to ask questions and interact. But it's a nice opportunity to maybe have a conversation in the car as you're driving to the next site, and to you know, just have a more relaxed view of the candidate. And it's all volunteers, and sometimes only 2 school committee members can do it. So, you know, one does it in the morning and one takes it for the afternoon, or however. You can have an employee take them around, but then you lose that insight.
I think it goes back to what Ken said about the dinner. It just, I like the idea of it. I'm just curious about how it would actually work out with our 22-member committee. Right.
You might want to have it more of your school food services have sandwiches delivered to a site in the school, so that it's less out at a restaurant. I don't know. You know, sometimes you give candidates a moment to breathe by themselves too, and you let them go. You know, you say, here, we're going to order you a dinner and give you a room where you can.
So Carolyn, I mean, how typical is it for school committees to have, I won't call it a working dinner, but I mean, in effect, that's what this becomes, right? So in your experience, is it that you typically give the candidate some downtime to grab a bite to eat and refresh and come to the meeting, or do you, is it typical that?
I'd say it's 50-50. So if you have to post it. So if you have it a more relaxed atmosphere, and the candidates can mingle. I mean, other people might join you. You can't stop it. It's a public meeting, but I think it's less and less common to go out to a restaurant with the candidate, and it's more and more common if school committee members want a chance to meet the candidate more casually than just at the interview that it's done on the school site. A lot of districts give them time to themselves, though, I have to be honest. You can decide that.
Well, clearly we have to wrestle with that one. So does anyone have thoughts on that particular topic? Linda?
I think given our size and dynamics, I would lean towards giving the candidate time to recharge at that point, especially if they're heading into a 90-minute interview right after. That would be my preference for what I would want to see.
Anybody else? Okay.
I agree.
Okay. So I think, the thing to do is maybe use this as a working model, start to get into some of the logistics. That's going to take some time, and start to go from there unless anybody has any objections. So we have 4 minutes. Carolyn, let's see if how much we can cover on reference checks in the next 3 minutes.
All right. So the candidates will submit a grid, and it will be by categories. And what school committee members, again, smaller committees, but they generally say who would like to be involved in calling references. Not everybody does. Maybe 4 or 5 people say, I have time. I'll make some reference calls, or maybe 6 people in total. It's not good for somebody to just call references about one candidate. So we say, take a category, for instance, teachers, and say, I'll make the teacher calls for all the candidates. Somebody else says, you know what, I'll make parent calls for all the candidates. Another might take school committee calls for all the candidates. So you divide up the responsibilities for making the reference call among the people who volunteer to make reference calls. And we provide for you sample questions to ask. You're not limited to that, but it does help sometimes to have some guidelines of how, things you might want to ask in your reference calls. And of course, you might have a candidate-specific question that you want to ask. You don't have to ask the same reference questions of every candidate.
Yeah. So thank you. So there's roughly 5 or 6 different categories of references, right? That's kind of the 10 to 12 references Noah's Ark referenced before.
Yeah.
To me, I think there's 2 ways we can go with this, right? So one is that we use this committee to divide up the categories, and one person takes a category and calls across the references for each of the finalists. The other way to do it is to put it out there as an open invitation to the school committee. I don't know if I'm going to get 4 responses or 18 responses, but then we just will need to figure out how to process that in a very, very quick and timely way. Let me open it up for thoughts, questions. Ken?
Yeah, I think the process part of it is almost as important as who asks the questions, in terms of, so if I'm calling, I'm not saying I'm doing this, but if I'm calling the school committees of all these 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 people, or whatever we're going to be shown, how do I share the results of that information in a way that isn't overly prejudicing my opinion I may be drawing from those? Does this go through NESDEC and then they kind of like process it and give us back a summary document, which would seem to be the best?
No. I know we're in limited time, but what happens is when you go to deliberations and you're discussing candidate A, you'll say, who made reference calls for candidate A? Well, I did, blah, blah, blah. And we'll talk about that. But no, NESDEC does not process it, because you bring it up, and you can be as general and say, I called all the parents for Mildred, and they were all very favorable. You don't have to go into big details. As a matter of fact, the references themselves don't want their names brought up and quoted unless you tell them you're going to do that. You have to say, may I That's very interesting. May I quote you? Otherwise, you have to just give whether your impressions were favorable or this candidate, someone was telling me about a program that they started and they were very excited about it, et cetera, about this candidate. If there's something very memorable. I know I'm being.
So we're up on time, and so maybe the thing to do here is to pick up the conversation on references. I think what I'll look to do is schedule